So it's a pleasure to be here today and to have been invited to speak by Sam Clark-Stone and John Rush to speak to the British Eating Disorder Society today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to begin by thinking about the way in which this pandemic and the measures put in place to limit its spread have affected people with eating disorders. So as we know, this pandemic has meant that many countries, well, most if not all countries, have been on lockdown to limit its spread. And this has really created challenges for people with eating disorders. And clinicians and services have been working really hard to try to meet these. And early on in the pandemic, we heard from clinicians such as Riccardo Della Grave, a close colleague of mine in Villa Garda, about specific problems that people with eating disorders have been facing. And since then, we've had a number of peer-reviewed articles published on the topic, including the one here, which notes that the peculiarities of COVID-19 and the reaction of the public and governments have really particular relevance to people with eating disorders. And this is also evidenced by the fact that the National Eating Disorder Charity BEAT have seen an increase in people reaching out to them. So they've had a 73% spike in demand for their services during this time. So what does this mean for us delivering CBT for eating disorders during lockdown? Well, I'm going to be really thinking about the delivery of enhanced cognitive behaviour therapy. And given all of these challenges for patients and for services who just simply haven't been able to deliver treatment as usual, our CBT-E training group have proposed that CBT-E can be delivered using video conferencing platforms during this time. And if we look at the literature, it suggests that, sort of broadly speaking, video conferencing psychotherapy appears to produce similar clinical outcomes to face-to-face. But that wasn't specific to CBT for eating disorders. The literature there is much more limited. There was a trial 12 years ago by Jim Mitchell and colleagues of telemedicine CBT for bulimia nervosa. And that was found to be broadly comparable to the face-to-face group. And also patients found that the therapeutic alliance, they rated in the telemedicine CBT-E, they rated that well, and in fact even better than the reports from therapists. We haven't yet evaluated remote delivery of CBT-E, but I know that many clinicians have been using it for some time before lockdown, and anecdotal reports have suggested that it has been positive during the pandemic. So in collaboration with my colleagues, Riccardo Della Grave, Zafra Cooper and Simona Calugi, and Christine Born and Suzanne Bailey Strabler as well from our CBT-E training group, we put our heads together and we've written a paper as well to try and describe how each stage of CBT-E can be adapted in light of COVID-19. And Glenn Waller, who's here as well, and many other colleagues also came together and provided some really helpful guidance on delivering CBT for eating disorders during this time. Both of these papers are open access and freely available. So this diagram looks a little bit daunting, but what I wanted to try to do was just to think about the ways in which this situation has affected eating disorder psychopathology. So to try and have a kind of comprehensive view of that, I've put some of these factors alongside the transdiagnostic CBT-E formulation. I'm not suggesting that you change your formulation with people, but it's just to help us to think about the ways in which the situation's been impacting. So if you think about it, we're aware of the fact that people with eating disorders who already struggle to access evidence-based treatments are really having an even more difficult time accessing them now. And also combined with the fact that there may be an internal barrier as well, which is that some people are feeling less deserving of help during this time. So that might mean that fewer people are seeking help. In terms of the core psychopathology of eating disorders, so in CBT-E, that's the sort of way that people with eating disorders tend to judge their self-worth, largely or exclusively in terms of their ability to control eating, weight and shape. For many people, this has intensified during this time. For various reasons, including feelings of not being in control. And this is kind of common in these rather uncertain and anxiety-provoking times, but really particularly presses the buttons of people that we see. And of course, many aspects of life have become further marginalised, which is unhelpful for our patients, so socialising and other hobbies and so on. And also in terms of kind of life and moods which can trigger binge eating or restricting, then social isolation, tension with kind of household members, and financial and childcare worries have all been sort of taking their toll. And additionally, there have been unhelpful media messages really about how we will need to be careful about what we eat, so as, in case we become overweight, and we should all use lockdown as an opportunity to get fit. And these messages have been unhelpful for people with eating disorders. And in terms of dietary rules, of course, it's been difficult, especially initially, for people to have foods that they feel are safe and comfortable for them. And instead, people have had to buy food in bulk. People have been unable to exercise to compensate or modulate their mood. And for many people, eating obviously has become less of a social experience. So all of these things have served to sort of intensify dieting or trigger loss of control episodes. It hasn't all been sort of entirely negative though, and I think people have experienced it quite differently. And for some people, they've actually found this time's been helpful. So they've appreciated a distraction from thinking about, all the time eating, shape and weight. They found it helpful that there's been a focus on the importance of health and being flexible about eating. And there have been some sort of barriers to binge eating in terms of difficulty accessing binge foods, maybe having family members around more, which may have helped to break some habitual elements. And some people have found it really helpful to have loved ones at home, and especially during meal times. And this seems especially the case for adolescents. So moving on to thinking about CBT-E specifically, we really consider that this time has brought both challenges and opportunities. So one of the challenges has been that both therapists and patients have really, at least initially, were rather unfamiliar with the technology required to experience therapy in this way. Although that's improved over time. And in this situation, there's been a limited availability of devices and bandwidth at home. On the other hand, I think people have also found that treatment has been more convenient, efficient, less costly, perhaps less disruptive to daily life. And actually, some people have said it's been much easier to have, for example, sessions twice a week, which is an important part of CBT-E at the start of treatment. And all of these things may actually have been serving to increase therapeutic momentum, which is really crucial in CBT-E. There's also been the challenge with the lack of privacy at home on both sides, but on the positive, this has really helped to bring treatment directly into people's homes. And some of the challenges, can be dealt with. So, for example, there are ways of, as a boundary for you as a therapist, you could use your office, a photo of your office as your virtual background. You could suggest that your patient has a designated area in their home for the therapy. So there are ways in which some of these challenges could be offset. And of course, there's the issue of particular relevance for our patients, which is that people with eating disorders find the fact that quite often in these kind of video conferencing platforms, they can see themselves during the therapy session, and this can serve as an opportunity for checking and sort of scrutiny. But this could also be an opportunity for an in-session experiment where patients are helped to modify this behaviour live. And there are settings that can help with this. So, for example, in Zoom, the patient can choose to hide myself, but you as a therapist will still see them and be able to observe all of their non-verbal cues. So there are also general considerations that we've had to deal with, so security, regulatory and risk management challenges, and we've had to think about different video conference platforms. And this often seems easier, I think, with patients that therapists have already met. This sort of whole task, but either way, whether it's a new patient or somebody that you've met before, we really think it's important to discuss any concerns about this new way of working, whilst avoiding presenting this as some kind of inferior alternative. Because of course we do want people to, we don't want it to become self-fulfilling if people are not hopeful about change, and we don't yet actually know whether this way of working will produce any different outcomes. We suggest that therapists pay particular attention to engagement and loss of motivation, because this might be particularly at risk. And the emphasis in CBT-E is on the patient making changes and working on specific tasks between sessions, and remote treatment is entirely consistent with this. And this mode of working might actually really help to promote a patient's sense of self-efficacy about the changes that they've made in treatment. So I'm just going to turn my light on a bit, just 1 minute, it's very dark now. A bit brighter. So how to stay on track as a CBT-E therapist. So some tips, we suggest that you could try to ask yourself, are you doing anything differently in terms of your therapeutic style and use of procedures compared to face-to-face delivery? And if you are, what might be the effects of that? So are you, for example, perhaps not weighing people collaboratively in the session? Are you maybe rushing things, avoiding perhaps more challenging work? And also we need to be thinking creatively about whether, how we can deal with certain elements. So, for example, if you want to draw a formulation or create a document together, then you can use various features such as the whiteboard option. For example, if you're using Microsoft Teams, you can activate that. You can screen share and sort of create something in PowerPoint, or you could kind of screen share whilst drawing, or you can even have 2 screens as well, so that one screen of yours is on your sort of drawing. So there are lots of ways around this. And as usual, we suggest that you stay focused on addressing the eating disorder rather than trying to sort of deal with day-to-day crises, which may well be more of an issue now. So you can validate, obviously, concerns that people are having, but whilst recognising that actually if you help someone to recover from an eating disorder, and if they put all of their effort into that, they'll be in a much better position to cope with the current challenges. We suggest that you continue to use standardised measures for psychopathology and impairment to look at progress over treatment. And these can be delivered, for example, remotely. Our NHS Trust, Oxford Health, have used the EDQ and CIA within Microsoft Forms, so that's a way that they can kind of securely deliver those questionnaires. And I'm not going to go into all of the adaptations here for reasons of time, but you'll see in our paper the ways in which we suggest that CBT-E can be adapted during this time. This includes, for example, in stage 1, making sure that you discuss with your patient the topic of having remote sessions. You pay particular attention to engagement. Maybe whilst you are helping someone with regular eating, that you help to make a plan, not just for meals and snacks, but structuring their day with activities which might be useful for people whose days are lacking structure. And then in stage 2, again, when you take stock and review therapy, that you actually think about the impact that working this way has had on the therapy, and review with your patients their thoughts and feelings about that. Then thinking about stage 3, for example, it may be that when you address comparison making, that during the monitoring, that you ask people to pay attention to monitoring what they are doing virtually and online. So for example, if they are following influencers on Instagram or something, and they're spending time looking at their bodies and comparing themselves, then that's a really important part of what they should be monitoring. And that's always the case with CBT-E, but it may be especially relevant now when people are spending more time having virtual contact. And we need to get a bit more creative about thinking about how to develop people's pie charts during this time. But that's sort of possible, for example, online classes and so on. And then thinking about dietary restraint, we always encourage people to eat socially. That's clearly difficult now, and some people have very specific rules linked to social eating, such as wanting to eat less than other people. So we're trying to think, how can that element be introduced even now? So one way is for people to have virtual meals with friends and family, so they can log on to Zoom, maybe even have be eating and cooking the same dish. So just kind of trying to think of other ways to deal with that. We've found that the events, moods and moods module is probably especially relevant now, given the life stress and the negative effects of lockdown. So we're thinking proactive problem solving, functional mood modulatory behaviour, and sequencing what's happening leading up to changes in eating are all maybe especially important now. And then turning to the future, it's important to think about, if you're coming to the end of therapy with people during lockdown, how will things change when the world opens up? I mean, that could be quite a difficult transition as well. And what new challenges will they have to face and deal with that they haven't perhaps been dealing with during your sessions, and trying to think about what high-risk situations might be and how they can use what they've been learning in treatment in those situations. And we suggest that it also may be important to have more frequent follow-up sessions with people, given that this will be a difficult time. So Ricardo de la Grave is here, and he'll be joining us in the discussion to talk about the adaptations for adolescents during this time. And in general, it's my impression from colleagues and supervising people who have adolescent patients, that young people are appreciating having virtual conferencing sessions, but there are challenges with this group. So ambivalence might be more of an issue, and of course we need to be more careful in terms of risk management and physical monitoring. So just moving ahead now and thinking, well, after all of this, how are things going to be? Well, I've heard from patients and therapists some of whom don't really want to go back to the old way of working. And so there's certainly a need for research into this mode of delivering CBT-E, given that there may be a second lockdown, and also there's now an appetite for this way of doing things. So I think we need to think about cost effectiveness, potential benefits and harms, and clinical effectiveness generally. And this normalising of tele-therapy is likely to change the future landscape of CBT-E. And this is a good thing, because there is a big treatment gap between those who need evidence-based treatments and those who receive it. So this might go some way towards trying to deal with this and help with the various barriers to CBT-E, including top cost and time, and maybe stigma and convenience. And maybe also the world will be more ready for digital treatments for eating disorders too. And on this subject, CREDO have developed a digital self-help program for people with eating disorders characterized by binge eating. So I'm going to end now, but thank you very much. And I've just put some references up here for some of the things that I have spoken about. Thanks. I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. Glenn, are you able to unmute?
Yep, I can unmute. I'm just putting up my screen now.
Fantastic.
Give me a second. Better go to the first slide. Don't want to ruin the whole story, do I? Okay. If I'm very lucky, this is now going to show up. If I'm not very lucky, this is going to be a really weird presentation. But we will see. Okay, I'm hoping that's working. If it's not, yeah, this is just going to be me whittering anyway. Right, I'm going to say a lot of the same things that Rebecca did, because we came at this from slightly different angles, but I think kept coming back to the same point. And what I want to think about is a bit about how we've coped with the whole lockdown, how we've coped with the shift to telehealth. And then I want to think about the kind of adaptations we've had to make and what we can carry on into the future. And I'm going to talk more about BrEDS CBT, CBT-10 or CBT-T, and how we've approached that. And it probably won't be a huge surprise that whereas I think you can characterize CBT-E as being a relatively kind of methodical, fairly straightforward, stately progress through therapy, CBT-T could be described as rushing it. But the point about rushing it is, if we can make it work, then we're happy with that. So I'm not going to kind of get excited about whether we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, because that's always down to the outcomes. But what I am going to do is talk about the ways in which we've kind of hit this, very much hit the ground running here. So I'm going to start off with us thinking about the new normal, because we have definitely come to a new normal. You know, 4 months ago, I don't think I was particularly thinking of, you know, I'm going to do all the work from home. I wasn't thinking, is my dog going to bark halfway through this? Answer, yes, it probably will, by the way, just to warn you. That's a point you need to think about when it comes to delivering the therapy, by the way. I wasn't thinking that we're not going to be physically seeing patients. And you probably would have got me saying, oh, no, that couldn't work. Well, guess what? We didn't have a choice. So the new normal is a no-choice version. That's not entirely true. There was a choice, and I think some people made a terribly wrong one at the very beginning, but I'll come on to that in a moment. So just to give you a little idea about the history, 11th of March, the UK had 7 deaths from this pandemic. It was only on that day that it was declared a global pandemic. And people, you know, in the UK, in the US, were generally saying, that can't hit us. We're a civilized country. It can't get here. By the time we got to UK lockdown, we had over 300 deaths. As of yesterday, 41,000 deaths, and that's bound to be an underestimate. We're absolutely sure the real number is going to be more like 50 or 60,000 excess deaths as a result of all this. And we're not out of it yet, not by any means. The non-essential are still not making their way back. If we can do stuff from home, then we're going to be encouraged to do stuff from home. And I suppose the question I'm going to ask is not, should we be hankering for the old normal, but should we actually want the old normal at all? Or have we learned lessons out of this whole process that go along with that whole, okay, if you're going to be rushed into something, better learn something from it model? I will take a really key step, and this applies to the stuff Rebecca was talking about, applies to the stuff that I'm coming from, it applies to other therapies. We should be thinking about evidence-based treatment. We shouldn't be thinking there's a way out of it. The people we work with deserve the best we can do, whatever the circumstances might be. Don't be fooled into thinking, therefore, everything's going to be perfect. Of course it's not going to be perfect. We don't have perfect therapies. No one says we do. It's clearly a little bit deranged. But we need to offer our patients the best we can do at the time. So we've got some good therapies, but their effectiveness may suffer if things aren't as normal. And the question, of course, that we hit was, how the heck do you make normal out of what's happening to us right now? So the first point I want people to walk away with, remote therapy is not new. If you work with CBT, you know full well, therapy happens 168 hours a week, one of which is in the therapy room. Remote therapy is what's been happening all this time. So we've been teaching people how to do therapy, and they've gone out and done it. And that's been the most effective way of delivering CBT for a long, long time. So don't treat remote therapy as being something brand new. Whether we're in the room with the patient or not, different issue. Now, what could be going wrong? And there have been some errors, I think. The very first mistake I saw was some clinics said, do you know what? We won't see anyone for a while. We won't see them. We won't do anything online. We can't do this stuff online. We can't do it remotely. So we'll just shut down therapy. And after a little while, they start getting agitated by their bosses, etc. They got to deliver something here, guys. And the problem came because they'd said to patients, you don't have to come into therapy right now. It can't work. And then you're going to say, oh, by the way, come back in. We'll give it a try. And a lot of patients have said, you know, I'm not going to do it. I heard the most bizarre term I've heard in a long while, a shadow waiting list. A shadow waiting list, which is something you're on when you're not actually waiting to be seen. You're waiting for things in the world to change so you can then go on a waiting list. And I'm sure there are several places in the country doing these. But nonetheless, that's quite a scary idea. It's kind of, we're going to tuck you away. We're going to forget about you. And then we'll come back to you when the world changes and when we think we've got time. Those people are waiting, and that's not going to help them. Fortunately, our best evidence therapies are designed around flexibility, not rigidity. If therapy can happen without us for most of the week, what is a special thing that happens at 1 hour a week when the patient's in the room? Unless you're a believer in the therapeutic pheromone, the idea that the therapist somehow gives off a kind of special musk that you have to sit near to in order to get better. If you believe in that, then definitely you've got to go see the patient, or at least host them a little sample. Reality is, and it's a point that Rebecca made earlier on and that other people have made, you can get good therapeutic alliances. You can get good action out of therapy delivered remotely if you do the right therapy. But that's not the same as I'm going to do therapy remotely. When therapies start falling down, it's because we adjust them. We drop key elements. Not we deliver them differently. One of the things I've always liked about CBT is right at the heart of it is the word flexibility. We flex to that patient in front of us, not to the nature of patients in general. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So when we get a patient in front of us, we flex to that patient. We don't say, oh, well, we can't do X, Y, and Z, so let's not do those techniques, and we'll do whatever else we can. That's the evidence-based versions anyway. And so we got some early responses. And there's Rebecca's one with Simona, Zafra, with Ricardo, etc. Lovely paper, well worth getting. Our one, they're both open access, you can go grab them for free. And they're both designed around this very issue of, well, if we can't do things normally, let's at least do things abnormally, but well. And that in lots of ways is how I see this. We're doing things in an abnormal way, but that's not a bad thing. So go grab the papers. You've already got references for them. It's not difficult. We've got emerging themes. In the paper that we wrote, it wasn't about CBT-ED, it wasn't about CBT-T, it wasn't about CBT-E, it was about therapies in general, with a bit about CBT-free disorders in there. So the first thing we identified was, if you ask clinicians, what should we do? Business as usual. That's got to be the attitude. So when we asked all these clinicians, come up with tips for us, the one that rang most true was, don't let it become something where it's obviously, oh, I've given up. So, you know, even daft things like wearing a tie. If I had any idea how you set a background, Rebecca, I would try setting one for my office, but I'd have to break into it to get the background because nobody ever told me this was happening. We discovered all kinds of stuff about technological experiences. I'm still waiting to see my first example of Zoom bombing. I'm quite looking forward to it in some strange, deranged kind of way, because if we can get through that, we can get through anything. There were issues around environment changes. They kept coming up. You know, what happens when you can't exercise? Do you know what? It's a bit of a naturalistic experiment. It's a kind of, what can we learn from this? We needed to think about regulatory frameworks because they vary, you know, from one country to another, from one state to another, from one profession to another. And we also realized that, and this is a point one of my colleagues made, we have to think about the impact on the clinicians. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm spending maybe 6 hours a day on online meetings, and I can feel myself just getting to the point where I just want to fall over at the end of the day, because it gets really tiring to do this stuff. And I can normally, you know, meet people, bang, 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 but that's more tiring. And then we talked about what were the CBT-free sort of techniques we needed to learn how to apply via telehealth. So we came up with a whole pile of tips. Again, take a look, they're all in there, about how to get people to eat, about how to conduct exposure. I can still remember having one of those moments of revelation when I realized you don't need a mirror to do mirror exposure. You've got the damn screen in front of you, use that. We don't do the thing that Rebecca was talking about of get the patient to turn off their own image. It's all good exposure work as far as we can see. But I can see it could come from either direction if it works. We got people doing weighing. We've gone back to what was, I think, with Fairburn in, about 83 said, get the patient to weigh themselves at home before everyone brought it into the clinic. You know, we're managing to make it work. We're even managing to get groups to work. And that's been quite a surprise to us. We've been able to get groups to work via forums like this one, where we just get them talking to each other and sharing experiences and sharing solutions. And you know what? Our patients are bloody good at finding solutions sometimes. Making CBT-T work. Now, here we're talking about a brief version of CBT. It's for non-anorexic patients, so that's about 85% of the people that we will see. And it's only 10 sessions, a couple of follow-ups. Now, this in many ways lends itself to telehealth actually quite scarily well from what we found, because we discovered that the key things we drive, early dietary change, weighing, exposure therapy, the inhibitory learning models, etc., are all things that we can push from very early on. And so we haven't actually hit any break in stride with this. You know, one of my colleagues and I were looking at her data from before, from during, and from the bridging point, and there is not 1 ounce of difference in her outcomes. And we're going to be following that up with lots of different places, trying to look for outcome differences between pre-COVID, during COVID, and the crossover period. And we're not seeing a difference in outcomes. We're still getting good results. Obviously, you've got to be flexible to the patient. Who hasn't? You've got to be aware of the patient's sometimes very shitty life. But we had that already. We're getting strong acceptability. We're getting strong outcomes. And they're being maintained through, now we're starting to see our follow-ups coming through with the same kind of outcomes. Similar sort of thing to what you're getting with CBT-E. Now, the difference here, I would say, the thing that's making a big difference about speed is we spend very little time on formulation, far more on the exposure to anxiety. And if you're ever going to do a therapy that's based around anxiety, guess what? During COVID, it's a bloody good time to do it. So we're pushing that anxiety element as much as we can to get the outcomes. So when I was thinking, well, if I looked at Rebecca's diagrams, I can see lots of differences. I'm going to disappoint you here, because if you're looking at those two diagrams and seeing what does CBT-T look like normally and what does it look like under telehealth, absolutely no difference. We're not going for big differences in style, tenor, etc. We probably wouldn't have time to be able to build them in anyway. We are avoiding issues like, can we wait till the patient comes in again? We're just saying to the patient, you know what, let's give this a go. If it doesn't work, we can try it again when we're back in. But for now, let's not make you wait, let's go for it. We're also saying no to extending the therapy. A few of our clinicians said at the beginning, well, should we stretch it to 15 or 20 sessions? But the boundaries keep the patient focused on change, and so far the outcomes are looking promising. Should we slow down the pace of change? We've always been about big change, so there's no point slowing it down. And is there anything we should drop? The only thing that we have dropped, and this kind of taps on something Rebecca talked about earlier, was trying to do experiments around body comparison. Because when people are at the front window the whole day, they're not doing that much comparison. Though we do get them to make comparisons on social media websites, if that happens to be one of their big things. So broadly speaking, this is very much like it was before. It's just not being done in the same room with the patient. So we've got that business as usual attitude. One of my colleagues pointed this out, we should always dress the way we would in therapy, because that kind of convinces the patient this is something serious. I always dress this badly. So there's no difference for my patients. Other people dress up a bit more. That's fine. We still keep to our session for, oh, sorry, I should have warned the cat warnings, by the way. If you've got one of those cats that loves to come and sit on a hot laptop, warn the patient. That is deadly scary. I've had it happen to me with a couple of colleagues, and a big cat suddenly appearing here is not the nicest sight. We stick to our session 4 reviews. We make our decisions about progress, and we stick to those. And we keep, exactly as Rebecca was saying, we measure progress, we measure outcomes, and we constantly feed that back to the patient. And most of all, going back to Terry Wilson's idea, that firm empathy stance. Yep, I get it. This is a really shitty way to be, but we don't do something about it now. You know what? It ain't going to change. So let's get on with making some change. We worked out our technology. We've used phone, we've used video, we get all the online diaries, etc. Some people use them, some don't, but we've found ways of getting them off pretty much everybody. We use the exposure to food. That was tricky for a bit because people were worried about going out and getting food. So we got food deliveries, food parcels brought by parents, etc. But now people are just popping out to the co-op and buying something and bringing it back in. And then weighing. We just need to make sure that, okay, get your scales out, put them down, check your weight, let us know what it is, put them away again so it doesn't turn into checking. And rather ironically, and a couple of my patients have pointed this out, 2 weeks beforehand, you told me to get rid of the scales. Now you want me to get more scales? Yep. So the British weighing scale industry has done well out of this business, but that's about it as far as I can see. We use behaviour experiments, particularly around foods that are hard to get. If you can't get your favourite food, let's try something different. Let's try changing that exercise regime. I think I was probably most worried about this. Can you do the emotional work? And you know what? Our patients are doing great reattribution work. They're doing great imagery rescripting. We're getting to use their counter-schematic behaviour, and they seem to work fine online. Maybe there's not something so pheromone-based about therapy after all. And then the standard body image work, exposure, checking, surveys. The only difference with surveys is our patients are actually getting more of them out there now because they're using social media to get them, which is good fun. And the outcome so far, we've got this stuff going on in various different countries. And the clinician experience is very much, it's actually going pretty much as normal. Really importantly, the worry that they had about the alliance going down the pan isn't happening. And I've seen a paper today that's just been submitted that shows exactly this. We already knew that things like online care, even computer-guided care, can get just as good an outcome in terms of the alliance. But now what we're seeing is the alliance actually seems to work pretty well here compared to face-to-face. And we have had patients saying, can we just carry on online? Because this is so much easier. You know, remember, we sit there waiting for the patient to come to us. If you're a patient and you live in the middle of Wales and you want to get to your nearest therapist, you're probably traveling about 6 hours in the day as a bare minimum. This is allowing that patient the same capacity to get to therapy, and it's not wasting another 4 or 5 hours of their life. I think there's something virtuous to this that we may need to pay a lot of attention to after the event. We're not having huge numbers of people drop out. We've got pretty much the same kind of rate. We're not getting people who are asking for delays. The outcomes are pretty similar. Also, like I say, the early follow-ups are saying, actually, people are holding it. And my guess is, if you look at CBT, and that'll take probably a little longer, you're probably going to find the same thing. Remember, CBT is about getting it buried in the patient's head of how to do this stuff. And once they've done it, they can hold on to it. Our job is not to have them with us the rest of our lives. Our job is to get rid of our patients so that they can go on and have their lives. That's a really important thing to hold on to. So when the new normal is over and done, when we can all say, oh, thank God, we can go back to our office, I can find that half-eaten bag of crisps in the drawer and maybe see if they're still edible, little things like that. I think we need to be careful about going back to the old normal versus going back to a brand new normal. So the old normal, we like a bit of comfort, but all this kerfuffle has actually given us something we could learn, something where we've learned how to do telehealth, not to save money. Because some of those early studies of telehealth were not about get people well. They were about save money. They were about do it more cheaply. And I think what we've had to learn, and again, one huge great experiment, we have learned, I think, fairly effectively, you know what? We can do this stuff without it being about saving money. We can do it for the sake of the patients. Now, we've always known the old normal had some problems. The services are poorly distributed. You can be hours away. If you're not underweight, it's really hard to get seen in most parts of the country. Services offering treatments with no evidence base. We can hope that we'll see that improve with this new Health Education England initiative. But there's still an awful lot of services out there that aren't doing the evidence-based stuff. And there are some services you can access online, but most of them aren't using the evidence-based treatments. So I'm going to argue here that what we should be thinking about is not, can we get back to the old normal, but can we establish a brand new normal? Can we take what we've learned from the last few months, the evidence-based techniques, the motivation, the alliance, the safety that we have to ensure, the patient preferences, and offer these treatments, CBT-T, CBT-ED, CBT-E, mantra, whatever it might be, can we offer them online as standard? Can we ensure fairer, easier access? Can we do them faster? That's my plug for the CBT-T. But of course, that's only worth thinking about if they work. So that takes us to our opportunity. In the past, as I say, telehealth have not been great. They never made it into the NICE guideline because they were always designed to be cheap, not effective, but cheap. So what happens if we do an evidence-based treatment via telehealth? What happens if we do the best we can with the best therapies we can, using the most initiative that we can dig out and deliver that via telehealth? Well, now's a bloody good time to find out. So we need a really important study. And I'm hoping we'll see enough people getting together to pull this together with CBT-E, CBT-T, whatever it might be, other therapies, to compare those people we used to see, the people we've been seeing entirely during telehealth, and the crossover group, the mixed treatment group. Now, that'll be a real fun thing to do, to find out whether it would be something that actually made any difference at all. Because if it doesn't, I think we've got some real honest truths to face about how much we put our patients through for something we find more comfortable. So well, let's see that done for other therapies too, though. I'm not here just to sell you CBT. I'm here to say if you're doing FBT, if you're doing mantra, if you're doing SSCM, whatever it might be, try it out. Look at the data, because this is a good time to hit the buffers, as it were. So what have we learned so far? Well, old fogies like me, and I'm definitely an old fogey, we tend to always assume that we've got the best approach that we can get. And we allow for slow and steady evolution. So across my time in eating disorders, I've seen marginal shifts in percentage of recovery. That's always been great, etc. But evolution is slow and steady. Sometimes the world changes. You get more of a revolution. And we've learned over the last few months, we can respond to what started out as a crisis and now becomes normal. And what I'm going to argue about is the notion that we should go back to that old normal. I think we might need to learn the brand new normal in CBT for eating disorders might just be better than the old normal. And those are those two resources that Rebecca's already put up. There's the BABCB guidance as well. And that's me finished, guys. You can mute me again all you like, John.
Thanks very much, Glenn. That was another very useful talk. So yeah, if you unshare your screen. So I think we've got everyone on speaker view, and I think if I unmute everybody, this works. And we're joined by Ricardo. Rebecca, was it okay if I ask you to introduce Ricardo, who's joining us for the panel discussion?
Of course. So I'd like to introduce Ricardo de la Grave, who is head of the Eating and Weight Disorders Department in Villagarda Hospital, Italy. And he has pioneered the use of CBT-E in inpatient services and for adolescents. So I'm pleased to have him here today with us.
John, I think.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, sorry. Sorry, Sam. No, please.
And Sam, do you want to chair this section?
No, I was going to say that you were muted, Ricardo, but you've unmuted, so go ahead.
Okay.
To hear about your experiences with adolescents, because that's something you're very interested in, and obviously Italy went into lockdown 3 or 4 weeks before the UK, so you're even more experienced. So tell us about what it's been like for you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the nice invitation and also for the presentation. I really appreciate both the presentation of Rebecca and Glenn, and most of the suggestion that they explain. I completely agree, both theoretically but also with my clinical experience in these last 3 months. As Sam, you just described, we start to have a lockdown about 3 weeks earlier than the other European country, and it was a little shock because I am the director of one of the biggest eating disorder units in Italy. We have 30 beds, and we had 4 positive patients with COVID for anorexia nervosa because we were not prepared. We had no masks and many things that I see that are all the other European countries have the same problem similar to Italy a couple of weeks later. However, first of all, we were lucky because our patient with anorexia nervosa, I was really worried because they were severe underweight, but they didn't have any negative consequences about the COVID. Also, 3 of them were almost asymptomatic, and one just some smell problems like this. So this was very good for us. But I realized, as Rebecca, but particularly Glenn, underlined that we are experiencing a new way of thinking about the treatment, because I was obliged to move all the treatment remotely, also in the inpatient unit, because we had to deliver also in the inpatient unit the psychological treatment by Skype or Zoom. We had also, for example, in the inpatient unit, some psychoeducational group, and I still deliver psychoeducational groups still now. And it is really very effective. We save a lot of money. The patient really appreciate this. One of the problem that we have in the inpatient, we had in the past in the inpatient treatment is, for example, in Villa Garda, because we accept patients from all over Italy, was the post-discharge treatment, you know, that it was the logistic problem was a big challenge, because sometimes they come back at home, they receive a completely different treatment with a lot of problem in this transition. And when in the past, because we started to use remote therapy a couple of years ago with patient discharged from the inpatient unit, but both the therapist and the patient were a little skeptical. As Glenn underlined very well, it seems that was not an optimal way of deliver the treatment. But now we are obliged to deliver in some way the remote therapies, and we are overcoming some skepticism, both from the therapist and the clinician. We realize, for example, that it's much better to deliver now the CBT at a distance with Skype or Zoom remotely than using the mask during the session, because with the mask the distance is more difficult to have a therapeutic alliance, because the non-verbal, you know, communication is a big obstacle with a mask. You know, it's really difficult to deliver a good psychotherapy session. So I think we are changing the way of delivering the treatment. I'm sure for the patients that are discharged from the inpatient that we can maintain continuity. We resolve a lot of logistic problem. The treatment is cheaper also, because they don't lose time, you know, for example, for people that is coming 100 kilometers or more from the unit, they spend 1 day to come for 1 hour session. Now they can have a session at home. I spoke about this also with the colleagues, because I'm doing supervision with the Bergen group in Norway. And in Norway, one of the big problems are the distance, you know. And now the use of remote therapy is overcoming many challenges. The second question is about the younger patient. And with the younger patient, it seems that this type of treatment in some way is more engaging, because they first of all, they are used from school, you know, the transition to when they close the school to use Zoom, or you know, the lesson with you know, Skype or other technology, and also the younger patient are used to use you know, FaceTime, WhatsApp, you know, another technology with friends, with teachers, and also with psychologists. They also, I realize that they are really appreciating that they are usually in the session, they are in their home, in their rooms. So it is easier to, in some way, to develop a good, you know, collaborative relationship, because this is one of the challenge when you treat adolescents, you know, an adult with a young people. So I think it is not an obstacle, and with adolescents we can, you know, implementing also in the future this type of treatment. It is clear that these are just only clinical impression, but I don't know if it is the lockdown, you know, this difficult period, but we had no dropout. You know, I can remember only just one dropout. So this is a way of approaching the therapies that not only reduce is not negatively affecting the dropout rate, but can reduce the dropout. And also we can also, for example, now that we are opening also we are starting to see patients face to face, as Rebecca described in the first part of the treatment, the first 4 weeks. We in CBT, the implementation of CBT required a twice a session weeks. So with remote therapy, we can do one session face to face and one remotely. So it is easier. I am collecting data, so I don't know what if the outcome is different. But it seems from a clinical point of view, my clinical point of view, that this approach is promising. The question is when the lockdown will finish, the change on the psychopathology that the patient obtain in a more, you know, in an environment where the patient is not exposed to many triggers, schools, comparison with peers, pressure to be thin, if they maintain the change, because what I'm seeing that it is true that some patients are relapsing, but most of these patients are people that are not in the treatment, because most of the patients that are in treatment tend to improve. So I don't know if this improvement is related just to the treatment or to the fact that they are protected in some way. I made an analogy, and I'm finishing my comment now, with what happened usually in the inpatient treatment. Because in the patient treatment, the patient tend to change easily because they have a more intensive session, more support, but most of all, they are protected. They are not exposed to the external environment. And in people now that are locked down, there is less pressure from the external environment. So we have to see what happens when they go back to the normal life. Is they maintain the change that they obtain in this period, because the experience that we had with closed unit from the inpatient treatment, that is that the patient improve faster and easily in the inpatient unit, but tend to relapse when the patient go back home. So we have to collect data to see the outcome of this type of treatment.
Thank you, Ricardo. That's really helpful. John put up some questions and people have been voting for them. So I'm going to refer back to those. We haven't got any questions from the chat in the actual session as such. Rebecca and Ricardo, developing formulation diagrams in sessions. How are you actually doing it? I know you did refer to it, but what kind of methods are you using? Is it vary from patient to patient, or have you developed a particular way of doing things?
Do you want me to start, Ricardo? And
yeah, Rebecca, start.
Carry on.
Yeah.
I think it does depend on. I mean, first of all, I guess a starting point is thinking, what video conferencing platform are you using? So, for example, if you were using Zoom, there are a few different options. So you can use the whiteboard, and also Teams has a whiteboard as well. The only thing I've found is that when you do use the whiteboard, it's best to keep the formulation really simple, but we like to do that in CBT-E anyway, but you really can't write a lot just because it's a bit more difficult. So, you sort of keep your words down, but that works, I think, pretty well. Another option that I've tried, or that people have tried, is the 2-screen option. I don't know if people are sort of familiar with that. So say if it was Zoom, you would have another device like your phone, and you'd basically connect to your Zoom session with your phone at the same time. And then what you can use is your phone on a tripod, or just sort of point it at a bit of paper. And then it's almost as if there's 3 people in the room. There's the patient, there's you, and then there's your bit of paper. And you can just draw normally. You have to mute it. And then you can just put it down when you're not drawing a formulation or something collaboratively. So I think that works well. I think some people have been preferring, and this is maybe more driven by the therapist, but if therapists like doing something, say with PowerPoint and using typing, I think some people have used that. So I think there's different methods. And again, I would tailor it to the patient, because it's sort of thinking, you know, what sort of screen are they viewing on as well? And so in some cases, for example, whiteboard is better because they've got a smaller screen, and it gets a bit more tricky if you have a sort of third gallery image. So I would adjust it depending on the therapist, sort of what they've got, and the services obviously often say that you need to use certain platforms. I don't know, that's just some initial thoughts. It seems to sort of work okay. I don't know what you found, Ricardo.
Yeah, I agree. There are many ways of doing the formulation. Yeah, the Zoom is you can write directly. It is not so, you know, simple like to, you know. However, I use the iPad. And I can write, and so I can send directly. But you can do also in a normal paper, and to take a picture also. You know, it's clear that in CBT we build the formulation step by step in a collaborative way with the patient. So I think it is not a big obstacle, you know. And at the end, when we conclude the formulation, we take a scan of a picture, and we send to the patient, and the patient can do all the adaptation during the week. Okay? So the technology permit, I think, to share the formulation, and also to do the formulation step by step in a collaborative way with the patient. Yeah, I suggest to do what the therapist is more comfortable with when doing this. So it is, it's not, there are no rules, I think.
I think that everybody's been thrust into an anxiety-provoking situation, haven't they? And so we're learning to cope with anxiety as well ourselves.
Yeah, also you can, you know, if you mistake, you change. You know, it is a collaborative way, the building of the formulation. So I don't think it is.
If I could just chip in on this one.
Sure.
We do much simpler formulation around particular behaviours, etc. And I've discovered a brand new, exciting way of doing it, which actually mirrors what we do if we're in the room with somebody. So very often I'll be drawing on the board and saying to the patient, write this down, write it down now so that you can understand it. So the thing I've taken to doing is when I'm really short of technology, I hold up a piece of paper with it on it. And it's amazing how often people can remember to write things down when you say, copy that. And it's the act of getting them to copy it in itself can be something that's quite helpful. You need a slightly thicker pen than normal, but otherwise it seems to work quite well for those simple little points that you're after. Otherwise, the other techniques that these guys have talked about make perfect sense.
That's great. Thank you, Glenn. I've got a question for you to start with, Glenn. It's specifically about monitoring weight in session. Because I agree entirely that the scales industry must be doing really well from us at the moment. So specifically though, can you talk us through the practicalities of how you've been addressing weighing people in session in their homes?
Yeah, We set out the usual instruction, which is don't weigh yourself between sessions. Don't weigh yourself at the beginning of the session. We don't want them using any of those safety behaviours to cut down their anxiety. Because of the approach that we take, we want the patient anxious when they get on the scales, because when they're anxious, their belief about what will happen to their weight is it will shoot up. And if we can get them to realise that it doesn't go up like they believe it will, they learn more quickly. That's that inhibitory learning model. So what we do is we say, right, take us through what you've eaten. Gosh, that's well done. That's great. You ate chocolate. I'm very impressed. First time you've eaten chocolate, you weren't sick. That's absolutely great. Well done. And all the time, what we're after is building up the patient's anxiety about, oh my God, what's going to happen to my weight when I get on the scales? And then when they get on the scales, immediately after you've got this level of anxiety there, they realise, actually, I was wrong. My weight has barely moved. So that prediction I've got of it going up by 3 kilos just hasn't happened. And that's a really big learning point for them. Now, the key thing, obviously, is you don't know if you can be 100% sure certain the patient is actually weighing themselves. I've had patients just show me what the weight was on their laptop or on the tablet. But you never quite know the truth around this stuff. So we tend to say, well, look, if the patient's managing the balance between their weight and their binging, etc., then we tend to think, yeah, that's what they need to learn. So it's build up the anxiety, let them learn quickly their weight doesn't do what they think, watch the learning just happen real fast that way round. And then at the end of the session, of course, we always get them having built up the plan for what they're going to eat over the coming week. What do you think will happen to your weight next week? And the point of that is not to know what they'll actually weigh next week. The point is, I want that patient scared at the end of the session. Not to the point of collapse, but enough that they're thinking, oh my God, I've really let myself in for it this time. I've agreed to eat 3 snacks as well as my 3 meals. It's going to do terrible things to my weight. Because if the patient comes out with the homework and you agree with them what they're going to eat, etc., and you say to them, so what will happen to your weight as a result? And they say, probably it'll be okay. Then you haven't pushed them as hard as you could have done. So again, with this BrEDS therapy, we're always looking to get that inhibitory learning process going, maximize the anxiety, maximize the learning. So when it comes to weighing the patient, it was Vicky Mount who put it this way, the thing about weighing the patient is that 95% of the action doesn't have anything to do with a set of scales. It's all the prep that you do, it's all the work afterwards that you do that really makes the weighing so hugely effective at teaching the patient that they've been wrong for maybe the last 10 years. And it's something that takes a bit of time to learn, but I'd rather they learnt it than not.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Rebecca and Ricardo, anything to add about practicalities of weighing remotely?
I'll start maybe and then ask Ricardo what he's doing. So I think going back to Glenn's point earlier about even though I spoke about the adaptations during COVID, in general, most of what we're doing remotely is the same. And we sort of try to make sure that all of the key CBT-E elements are included. So in CBT-E, we would always collaboratively weigh at the start of the session. So we sort of go to the scales and, write down weight, and then we'd put it on the agenda to discuss. And so we suggest that you can try to just recreate that same experience. And so I think what it's ideal to do is to prepare the patient so that they can actually hop on the scales, ideally sort of just hop on them at the start of your session. So actually when the video's going and everything, they sort of hop on, you say, oh, could you just sort of tell me the number on the scales, jot it down. And then weight is an item on the agenda. And you would kind of plot it on the graph together, you talk about it and so on. And the reason I'm suggesting doing it that way, rather than, maybe they just do it and then you talk about it later, is because I think we see collaborative weighing as a really important part of treatment, and that kind of includes the process of it, and we want it to be therapeutic. We don't want them to sort of maybe do it at some other point and then ruminate over it, or do it when they're most anxious or when they've eaten something or whatever. We want to sort of keep it kind of tied to the therapy session, not tied to how they're feeling or what they've eaten. And if you do it together, you can include that sort of the element of your kind of relationship that you have with them and keep it in the therapy and talk about it together. So I know that's a bit difficult if the scales are sort of in a different room in the house, but usually if the device is movable, the device could go or the scales could move. One of the challenges, of course, is normally you prepare for people weighing themselves at home by having this kind of calibration period, this recalibration, where you talk about how the scales you have in the clinic will be different from theirs at home and so on. And clearly you can't do that when you're just thrust into it. So that's a bit of a challenge, but we just say to people, okay, there might be a little bit of variability with your initial number on the scales, but let's get 4 weeks of reading. Let's look at trends over time in the way we usually do. So that's some of my thoughts. I don't know. What do you think, Ricardo?
I completely agree with you. And from the CBT perspective, collaborative weighing is one of the key procedures. The goal is for patients that are not underweight is interpreting the change, distinguishing the fluctuation from the trend. And this, in our experience of the collaborative weighing, but especially helping the patient to, interpreting the weight change is crucial to reduce the weight preoccupation. That is a strategy that we start from the beginning of the treatment, because when they reduce the weight preoccupation, they are more available to address the dietary rules and dietary restraint. In underweight patients, especially in adolescents, we use also the collaborative weighing to help the patient to interpret the change and to suggest the change of the dietary content to increase the body weight, for example, 0.5 kilogram per week. So we use also the collaborative weighing in underweight patients to help a patient not to increase the anxiety, but to feel in control during the change of the weight regain, because when they can predict what happened, and for the patient it is easier to address, in increasing of a diet, for example, to increase the body weight. And when they have a reduction of the preoccupation of body weight, it is easier for them to address also dietary restraint, but also dietary restriction. We really didn't find any difficulties in collaborative weighing in the session remotely. We, as Rebecca suggested, we ask the patient to do the collaborative weighing in the session, not outside the session. And also, there is a problem of a calibration when we had the problem of the calibration when the patient moved from the face-to-face treatment where they use the scale of a therapist at home, but this is a problem that usually we address towards the end of a treatment in CBT. So after a couple of weeks of calibration, we can go on the same way.
Thank you.
The weight graph, so we have to share the weight graph. We usually I can add this, is the therapist that usually prepare the weight graph and send to the patient how to use the weight graph according to the CBT procedures.
Did you send a photograph of it, or?
Yeah, I can send, for example, a file, where we wrote in advance the weight graph, okay, with the weeks, and in Italy, we use kilograms, 0.5 kilogram. The division is in 0.5 kilogram, not in hectogram. And you use a different, measures in England. Okay.
Okay.
And Sam, as well, you can just do, I think what Glenn was mentioning earlier, just do it on your graph paper and then just hold it up.
Yeah, so. and both the therapist and the patient have to have the graph, the weight graph. The therapist have to maintain the weight graph.
Can I just mentioned
Sorry,
that
I was going to say we have a little Excel file that does this as well.
Yeah.
So you can use that to share between people. Sorry, Sam.
No, I was just going to say that all the papers that everybody has mentioned, the open access papers, are all available in the COVID group on the BrEDS workplace. So people shouldn't even have to go and search for them elsewhere. They just need to run a search for them on the website, on the workplace, and you'll find them as downloadable PDFs. Got another question which John posed, which was, at what point do you decide CBT is not suitable to continue when the client continues to blame COVID-19 for the excuse not to change? Glenn, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, we still aim for the kind of 4-session review point. And if the patient's hitting us with therapeutic behaviours, it doesn't matter whether it's to do with COVID or anything else, then we will simply come back with that very Marshall Linehan approach of, look, if you're not able to do it right now for whatever reason, let's stop, if that's the appropriate method. But the alternative is we could try working our way around these. So we'll, if the patient isn't taking part, isn't engaging fully, by session 2, we'll be raising that with them. We're not looking to spend ages getting them into that state, because we've found that as long as we can get them to session 4 with some substantial change, they do really well. Now, dropout rate is really low once we get to session 4, so we want them really engaged by then. So if a patient comes on saying, I can't get my favorite yogurt, or I can't go out, or I can't exercise, etc., so I've got to restrict, etc., we play that as a therapy interfering behavior. Circumstantial or to do with the patient, it doesn't really matter. But we come at it very early on, because if you leave it, it becomes the norm for the therapy. And once it's become the norm for the therapy, then it's really hard to shake.
That's helpful. So, same as usual. How about CBT-E?
Ricardo, did you want to go first?
Yeah, we have, maybe I can answer for the underweight patient, and Rebecca from the not underweight. Usually, with patients that are underweight, we have step 1, we call, where we discuss with the patient the implication to address or not the weight regain. And usually after 4-6 weeks, if the patient doesn't take the decision to address weight regain and the eating disorder psychopathology, we stop the treatment, because it's a collaborative approach, and the patient needs to take the decision to actively address the weight regain. But this doesn't happen so often. I think there is not a big difference between the face-to-face therapy and the remote therapy. However, it is important for the COVID not to deviate from the content of the treatment. If a patient wants to speak about the COVID, we have always to discuss, to take the COVID preoccupation and problem, to link with the eating disorder psychopathology. This is crucial, not to deviate from the content of CBT. And however, after 4 weeks, every 4 weeks, we have a stage 2 revision where we address the obstacles, we review the improvement, the change of the patient, and we address any obstacles. And if we find obstacle, we try to address early, because we know if a patient doesn't change early, the treatment tend to go bad. And this is one of the difficulties of the CBT in general, to understand what are the obstacles of the patient and which strategy to address the obstacles. I don't know, Rebecca, maybe you can add something
Yeah,
more.
I mean, I completely agree. So CBT-E is a treatment that's about change, and if people aren't able to make changes, then it doesn't seem right to just be continuing with a sort of farce of therapy. So it's really important that they're able to do that. And just building on what I think Glenn was sort of mentioning earlier, in some ways, if things are worse in terms of the eating disorder in this situation, it's sort of good, because it means the treatment will really be able to address these important issues. It's harder almost if things are a bit better during COVID, then it's sort of a bit harder. But if things have been aggravated by the situation, then you've got plenty to go on in your session. So it's a sort of, you know, really opportunity to really address everything. And the other thing is that what treatment is doing is it's trying to change what's keeping the eating disorder going. And usually it's possible for people to see that if COVID is making things more difficult, that actually there's a sort of specific reason for that. So is it because they've got extreme dietary rules that's why it's very difficult for them when the foods aren't available? In which case it's sort of a way to just reinforce that and say, well, look, we can tie that in to the diagram of what's keeping your eating problem going, and it's a really good reason to address it. Or if, you know, people are finding it really difficult to cope with stress, then we can think, let's use the proactive problem solving, let's give you other ways of coping with stress. So I think in many ways, if people are struggling in this time, it doesn't necessarily create a big problem for CBT-E, because I think it's already well designed to deal with those problems.
Okay, thank you. Got time for a final question. It's kind of slightly different. If a client has EUPD and so the personality disorder, emotionally unstable, and an eating disorder, what are the panel's thoughts on doing CBT remotely when other risks increase, motivation goes down, for example, increased alcohol or self-harm? Glenn, any thoughts about that?
Loads, but I'll keep it fairly short so everyone's got a chance to talk. We have never found an early diagnosis of borderline or EUPD to be a problem. It doesn't seem to affect outcomes. And I think that's true of an awful lot of literature. And it's almost certainly because a huge amount of what we think of as borderline symptoms are actually starvation symptoms.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm starved, I can't think straight. When I'm starved, my emotions are all over the place. I'm more impulsive. I'm more panicked, etc. So the recipe we use, and this goes back to something Chris Fairburn said many moons ago, there's a medicine for this, it's called food. Now, that's not saying everybody's got a borderline or EUPD doesn't have that, but we need to give people the best chance. And if we back off thinking, oh my God, that person's going to be at much higher risk because we're trying to get them to change, we're actually in danger of leaving them exactly where they were for a very long period of time, when it could be, and we know this from the literature very strongly, it could be that what they need, and I don't mean to trivialize this, sometimes what you need is a sandwich, not the most exotic therapy in the world. Sometimes you need to actually do the eating first to get back on track so that you can then deal with the underlying issues. So the first thing to do in those cases is get the person used to eating some more and see if that has a big effect or not.
I'm sorry, Rebecca.
No, it's fine. You say, Ricardo.
No, I completely agree with Glenn. We in CBT we never use the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder or personality disorder, and we start with all the patient addressing just the eating disorder psychopathology. If only if the patient is not improving, we try to see if there are some, according to the CBT terminology, some external maintaining mechanisms of the eating disorder. And but this needs to be very severe. It is clear that they are, an obstacle to change, and it is clear that they are maintaining the eating disorder psychopathology. In this case, we can discuss the possibility to use some broad modules, like, for example, mood intolerance or interpersonal difficulties. However, having done a study with very severe cases in inpatient treatment, where we made a randomized control trial comparing the BCBT and CBT with very severe patients. And I assure you that almost 70% of the patients that we admit at Villagarda have received a diagnosis of personality disorder. They respond at the same way. We have the same results 1 year after the discharge from Villagarda, from the F version and the B version of CBT. And what you see after weight restoration, and but also just after 4 weeks, after after not just weight restoration, but also when they start to eat, that many symptoms that are attributed to personality disorder, mood intolerance, mood instability, irritability, isolation, also self-mutilation tend to improve with renutrition. So this is our strategies. So I don't know if you, Rebecca, you can add something about this.
Not really.
We prefer to look at the personality, not to the personality disorder. Okay. So
yeah,
how this maintain the eating disorder psychopathology.
Yeah, I agree. And just to sort of explain a little bit more about why we find it unhelpful in CBT-E to sort of use those diagnoses, it's because often people have been given that diagnosis when actually, if you look at them during their adulthood, they've had an eating disorder for that entire time. And really, to get that sort of diagnosis of personality disorder, if you believe it, you need to have had a time in adulthood, free, say, from something like an eating disorder. And often that hasn't happened. So much of what could be being seen is actually secondary to having an eating disorder, which and I agree with the statements about how to deal with it.
In CBT, we work on the mechanisms that are maintaining the problem, not the disorder. This is, this means that we need the patient to understand the mechanisms that are maintaining the eating disorder psychopathology, involving actively the patient in addressing this mechanism.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all our speakers for really stimulating and interesting presentations, and to thank, we've had best part of 100 people watching live, which is fantastic, and your presentation, well, the whole talk will be available for people to watch afterwards as well, and we'll also post the PDFs of the slides that people can then download from the workplace site as well. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to John. Thank you for Riccardo, especially for coming in from Italy, and Glenn and Rebecca. And I hope to see everybody again in fairly soon when we'll be doing some webinars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I'll end the meeting.